It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker of this morning. We are very fortunate to have as speaker Professor Benjamin Friedman, the William Joseph Meyer Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1972, right? Professor Friedman is one of the most influential economists in the United States, who has reached the full range of audiences, from academic scholars to policymakers and the general public alike. He has published exhaustively, I counted 17 monographs and over 150 academic journals. His main field of research is monetary economics, banking, and public finance. But this is not why he is here with us today. Besides his interest in banking and public finance, he's also interested in the moral foundations of economics. He's the author of a book titled The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, a classic in economics the New York Times advised every citizen to read, not every economist, but every citizen to read. Today he is here to discuss with us his latest big and very ambitious book titled Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. This monograph covers a broad time period from the beginning of economics as a scientific discipline in the late 18th century to what Ben calls the unification of religious and economic conservatism in our times, especially in the United States. Ben, thanks so very much for being with us at this conference. The floor is all yours. Please take it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jörg, for that extremely generous introduction, and thank you for organizing this marvelous conference. I enjoyed the proceedings yesterday, and I'm looking forward to the rest of today, and thank you also and your staff as well for their lovely hospitality. Now, Jörg suggested that I speak not on the subject of the religious influences on economic thinking in general, but rather on a particular episode in American history, namely the development of what we call the social gospel. And I'm going to do that, but I'm also, in light of where we are, going to talk some about parallels as I see them between what was happening in the American social gospel at the time, this is the late 19th century, and what was happening in Catholic thinking, in particular under Leo XIII with Rerum Novarum. Let me also say that it's a particular pleasure to be here at this university. People like Nyenhe and me take great pride in the fact that our university is the oldest one in the United States. But what that means is that in about 10 years or so, we are coming up on our 400th anniversary. And to be here and help you celebrate your university's 550th anniversary is quite remarkable, and I'm delighted to take part. And I should also say that I am very honored to be present at the home university, I think, of Jan Eck. Is that right? Just a month ago, I was lecturing in Zurich and spoke quite a bit about Zwingli. And so to go within a very short period of time from Zwingli's home church to the home university of Jan Eck is quite an experience, and I'm delighted to have it. Now, let me say, as Jörg already has, that I'm going to be speaking on the basis of my book from last year called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. But I'm not going to try to take everyone through the argument of the book. That would take much too long. I'll say a few things just at the beginning about the principal thesis of the book, and then move on right away to this episode that Jörg asked me to address, namely the rise of the social gospel in the United States in the late 19th century. Now, the question that I address in the book is whether religious thinking has had an influence on economic thinking, in particular the thinking underlying the rise of capitalism. And I begin at what I regard as the beginning, namely the origins of modern Western economics. And I ask why this line of thought emerged, when it did, and where it did. And to be even more specific, I have in mind what economists call the first fundamental welfare theorem, and that is the proposition that individuals acting merely on their own regard, out of their own self-interest, with no thought of altruism, can, and under the right circumstances, will end up taking actions that make other people better off as well. If you pause on it for a moment, that's a very, very fundamental and in certain settings very challenging idea. And I want to talk about where it came from and whether religious thinking had any influence on it. Now, there is a standard story which comes in two parts. Presumption one is that we look to Adam Smith, and in particular Smith's great book of 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Donald Winch, alas no longer with us, but the greatest Smith scholar of our time, called Smith's Wealth of Nations the fountainhead, as Donald put it, of classical political economy. And then the second presumption is that because Smith and Hume and the figures of that time were, of course, products of the Enlightenment, and because we have come to think of the Enlightenment as a movement away from thinking in terms of a God-centered universe, in the direction of what we in our modern vocabulary call secular humanism, it therefore follows that none of this intellectual development that gave us our discipline as we know it had anything to do with religious thinking. And my friend Nick Phillipson, who incidentally wrote the best current biography of Smith if you're interested in the work. It's not the best one if you're interested in the life, but for a one-volume treatment of Smith's life that gives you an insight into the work, Nick's is absolutely the best. And Nick, who alas is also now no longer with us, stated that not just the Wealth of Nations, but the entire Smith-Hume project to do for the science of man what Newton, almost a century before, had done for the science of the physical universe was, in Nick's words, built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Nick believed he was saying anything unusual when he wrote that in his Smith biography. He just thought he was saying the standard thing. Now, I accept in my book the first presumption. I agree with Donald Winch. The Wealth of Nations is the fountainhead of all political economy, but I reject the second of these presumptions. I think that's wrong. And I think instead the Smithian Revolution was powerfully enabled by what were then new and hotly contended lines of thinking within the English-speaking Protestant world, within which Adam Smith and David Hume and their great contemporaries lived. And what was it? In particular, it was a movement away from key elements of the Protestant Reformation. It was a movement away from predestinarian Calvinism, and especially in this setting, one might well ask, well, why was that new? Why was that not simply moving back to what they had before 1517? And that turns out to be a very interesting question, which I am not going to address. Now, let me be very clear that what I am not suggesting is that any of this had to do with self-conscious attempts by Smith or Hume or these other individuals involved to bring their religious commitments to bear on their scholarly writings. These men were international celebrities in their own lifetimes. We know a lot about them biographically. It would be absurd to make such a suggestion. Hume was an avowed opponent of any kind of organized religion. Many people think he was an atheist. Others think he was simply an agnostic. He used to refer to Church of England bishops as retainers to superstition. His great friend William Robertson, the head of the Church of Scotland, referred to him in writing as a heathen. Smith was much more private about his private religious commitments, personal religious commitments, but there is no evidence, none whatsoever, of any personal religious attachment on Smith's part. We know that he did have to appear in Glasgow and swear to the Westminster Confession as a condition of taking up his professorship. We did that, but we also know that he asked to be exempted from the requirement to start each lecture with a prayer. His request was denied, and so he always did it, but the prayer was mighty short. So Smith just had no interest in this whatsoever. So what then am I suggesting? What is the core idea? And for this I turn to Einstein, who famously argued that scientific thinking is a consequence, follows from pre-scientific thinking. And in yet a different paper, Einstein elaborated. He says that we seek to form for ourselves what I'm going to translate as a worldview in the original German, the Bild der Welt. You can correct my translation. And the reason is simply that the world is too complex. We're not going to make any serious progress if we don't make simplifying assumptions. We know that in economics. And so instead of trying to confront the world as it is, we confront our world image. And importantly, Einstein had in mind not just physical scientists. Here in this statement, he points to painters, poets, philosophers. Philosophers is important because, after all, Adam Smith never ever thought of himself as an economist. The word didn't exist in Smith's day. Smith was a professor of moral philosophy. And so this is what Einstein thought people did. Now, am I on good ground in applying this to economics? Some of my Harvard predecessors did, thought so. Joseph Schumpeter referred to the Preanalytic Vision, and that uppercase V is not a typo. Every time Schumpeter wrote Preanalytic Vision, the V was always capitalized. And what he meant is that when a person sits down to do some analysis, there has to be an intellectual chair in which he or she is sitting. There's something going on in the mind first. Well, I think this is comparable to Einstein's Weltbild. My late colleague and dear friend Ken Galbraith argued that economic ideas are always and intimately a product of their own time and place. Well, in the book I argue that what gave us modern Western economics was intimately a product of the time and the place in which Adam Smith and David Hume lived. Now, this movement away from predestinarian Calvinism in the English-speaking Protestant world was a rolling phenomenon. It was at its height in Britain in the latter part of the 17th century. Importantly, it was at its height in Scotland right at the time when Smith and Hume were coming to young adulthood and forming their image of the world. And I claim that that's important. And then it moved on to America in the latter part of the latter part of the 18th century, and some of us argue that this was not unimportant in the creation of the American Republic, but that's a conversation for a different day. Now, why would these, let's call them a-religious men like Smith and Hume, have paid attention to what was going on in the religious debates that were swirling all around them? I think there are a number of reasons. One is simply that they lived in a world in which religion was more central and more pervasive and more multidimensional than anything we know in modern society. In 1707, the Scots had voted themselves out of existence as an independent country, so they had no parliament left, they had no independent government, they had no monarch that was different from the English, but they did have a church that was different. And so in Smith and Hume's day, all forms of patronage in Scotland were church patronage. Intellectual life was more integrated in those days. My university, for example, has a divinity school, as we call it. We keep it carefully segregated about half a mile away from where the rest of us are. It's almost like the segregation that we impose on Nyenhe's part of the university. We arrange to have a river to make it, these people like Nyenhe are on the other side of a quite major river. That's not unintentional on our part. Similarly, the divinity school is kept well away. At Yale, it's even worse. The Yale Divinity School is about a mile away, and moreover, it's up a steep hill. So if you're going on a bicycle, you really have to want to get there. This was not the case in Smith's day. When Adam Smith was a professor at Glasgow, there were only 14 people on the faculty with the word professor in their title. Smith was the professor of moral philosophy. There was a professor of church history. There was a professor of theology. All of these people were on the same faculty, going to the same faculty meetings as we would think of them, housed in the same building. It was very different. And finally, here in Germany especially, I don't think I need to remind people of the contentiousness of the religious debate in that era. Only 100 years before, the 30 Years' War had been more deadly compared to the size of Europe's population than either World War I or World War II. The English Civil War, the same thing, which took place during the time of Adam Smith's grandfather, and many of these other events. The Highland Rebellion, for example, in Scotland, took place when Smith was 23 years old, and parts of the fighting were right outside of Edinburgh. He could not possibly have failed to pay attention. And most important, I argue in the book that there was a substantive coherence between the new economic thinking, to repeat what gave rise to the first fundamental welfare theorem, and the view of humans that was at the heart of this movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. In particular, a more benign view than Calvin had of the human character, and a more expansive, more optimistic view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. And in short, I argue that what Smith and Hume and the others were doing was secularizing the dominant, new to them, lines of religious thinking in the English-speaking Protestant world in which they lived. And I believe that this influence of religious thinking on economic thinking has well survived the passage of the initial religious influence. In effect, it acted as a catalyst. In chemistry, a catalyst is something that you introduce, and then the catalyst has its effect, and the catalyst is gone, but the effect of the catalyst is still there. Well, I argue that religious thinking played a catalytic role, and I claim that it has resonated within Western economics ever since, and here I list a few of the dominant episodes that I examine in the book. Now, what I am going to address at Jörg's request is this one here. the emergence of economics as what we would call today an ameliorative, policy-oriented inquiry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I argue that it was very influenced at the time by what we today and what they then called the social gospel in American thinking. And interestingly, I believe there were parallels to what was going on in the Catholic world under Leo XIII. So let's focus on the post-Civil War industrialization in my country. And let me point out that, again, following what was happening in Germany, this was a key period for the emergence of economics as an intellectual discipline. This was the period in which social science disciplines were starting to go their separate ways. This had happened in Germany a generation earlier, but it was now happening in America. The American Historical Association was founded, the American Economic Association in 1885. Soon after, the American Sociological Association, the American Political Science Association. All of these disciplines were becoming professionalized, and so it was a key period. Now, what was going on? This was a period of remarkable growth in the American economy, growth in two senses. One is vast population growth. Between the end of our Civil War and the First World War, the population of the country approximately tripled. But importantly, it was a period of very rapid growth in per capita living standards as well, coming not all continuously, but in two segments. First, for about a decade and a half after the Civil War, the per capita growth rate expanded at nearly 3.5% per annum. This is the largest, the most rapid sustained growth rate people in my country have ever enjoyed in our entire history. Then there was a hiatus in which there was pretty much absolute stagnation for a period of a decade and a half, and then the growth resumed, not quite at the remarkable growth rate before, but still at a pretty healthy growth rate right up to World War I. What were the drivers of this growth? Remember, unlike in Europe, where the continent had been settled forever, what the Americans were doing was settling a continent, and this meant westward expansion and further development of commercial agriculture. People were moving out of subsistence agriculture, small family farms. Nyenhe yesterday referred to yeoman farmers. Yeoman farmers was a good story in Thomas Jefferson's day. It was not anymore by the time the period we are talking about here. Railroads, by the time we are looking at here, American railroads were laying enough track every year to go across the continent and back. This was the beginning of the American steel industry. The Bessemer process had been imported from Germany, and by 1880, American firms were producing more than 1 million tons of steel a year. The country was industrializing, especially in the production of industrial machinery. Cyrus McCormick, in the middle of the century, had developed the reaper. This is what the McCormick plant looked like around the turn of the 20th century. McCormick was from Chicago. This is quite clearly large-scale industry. Urbanization. If you settle a continent, then for sure you're going to urbanize. And this is what the map of the United States settlement map looked like in 1850. The smaller dots, I hope you can see them, are towns of more than 5,000 but less than 100,000. And the heavier dots, of which there are not very many, are towns of 100,000. You can almost not pick them out. And by the time we get to 1900, the country looks extremely different. And also, electricity is being introduced at the time, street lighting in cities, uses in some private homes. Then, after this hiatus, to which I will return, there's this period of renewed expansion. Well, it was somewhat more of the same, but not. Part of what was more of the same was they were building even more steel. They were up to more than 30 million tons of steel by the time of World War I. And this is the period when America's industrial predominance emerged. This is steel production, and you can get up to about 1890, even 1900, and it isn't obvious who's going to be the industrial superpower of the world. But as you move past 1900, it becomes increasingly obvious just looking at the steel production. This is what an American steel plant looked like on the outside in that period. This is what a steel plant looked like for people who were working in one. What was new was the automobile, and what was striking in historical perspective is how rapidly this new invention took over. Ford Motor alone was building 250,000 cars by the eve of World War I. This is what the Ford assembly line looked like on the eve. This is pre-World War I, and this is what an American city looked like. This is the bridge crossing the river in Chicago. There are still a few horses, but by and large the street traffic is driven at this period already by internal combustion engine-powered vehicles. What else? Machinery, manufacturing, railroad cars, shipbuilding. More than 20% of the country's labor force, more than 8 million out of 40 million, were by this time working in the manufacturing sector alone. Urbanization is going along at full tilt. Population growth, also the growth of use of electricity, also new methods of construction, and also the development of the elevator by Mr. Otis made it possible to build not just out, but up. So we get urban skyscrapers in this period, and we start to recognize modern cities. This again is downtown Chicago right about the time of World War I. This is Herald Square in New York. Herald Square doesn't look like that anymore. This is the Flatiron Building in New York City, built in 1902. If Mr. Otis had not developed his elevator, you could not have done that. Nobody was going to walk up to the top floor and back every day. But with the Otis elevator, the people started to do that. And the development also of mass urban retailing, because if you had all these people living in a congested area, you had to have ways for them to buy what they wanted to buy. This again is Chicago. This is the Marshall Field store in the original. And so all of this is delivering extremely rapid increases in living standards, but there is a problem. Now, part of the problem I've already mentioned is this decade and a half of stagnation thrown right in the middle. If you were in America any time before the 1930s and you heard the phrase Great Depression, what you would have assumed the person was talking about was this period from the 1880s and on into the first half of the 1890s. A second challenge, which I'm not going to address, but it will show up in some of the thinking of the theologians that I'm going to mention, is the emergence of the large business corporation, question of whether that was a threat to American democracy. And this, of course, as I hope everybody knows, is a conversation that 100-odd years later is still very much ongoing in my country. But also the one that I want to emphasize is the creation of the urban industrial labor force, and in particular, the emergence of widespread urban poverty. Remember, people had just been moving in off of the farms, and so, of course, they understood urban poverty, they understood rural poverty, but urban poverty is different from rural poverty. You can see that today. You can see that if you go to the developing world, in the same way that cold weather poverty is different from warm weather poverty. If you go to the north of India, you see poverty. If you go to the south of India, you see poverty. It doesn't look the same. Well, similarly, urban poverty doesn't look the same as rural poverty. This is one of Jacob Riis's famous photographs from the 1890s, young boys in New York. This is an immigrant family in New York, again, a photograph by Riis. People understood that there was a problem, and this captured a lot of attention. You may have heard of an American economist named Henry George, who right at the beginning of the 1880s published a well-known book that captured the national attention called Progress and Poverty. The title itself was meant to capture attention. The whole idea that you could have this industrial progress and poverty coexisting was a new thought. So the title on Henry George's book was not just some accidental throwaway. The title really meant something. And then finally, there was widening inequality that became increasingly visible. This is the old Vanderbilt Mansion, alas no longer there, at the corner of 57th Street and Fifth Avenue in New York. So think about where Mr. Vanderbilt lived, and where are we? And this is what dwellings lived just a couple of miles away in lower Manhattan. There's the inside of one of the rooms inside Mr. Vanderbilt's mansion. And this is not even the bottom of the bottom. Again, this is just a couple of miles away. We looked before at the exterior of the Marshall Field store, the original in Chicago. This is the ladies' tea room on the inside of the original Marshall Field. And this is what shopping looked like in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So these contrasts were just absolutely visible to everyone. Now, this is what propelled what came to be known as the social gospel. What was the social gospel? The idea was to restore an active leadership role to the nation's Protestant churches in dealing with exactly the progress and poverty issue. And what were they doing? They were squarely looking at the economics. You can imagine many non-economic dimensions of the issues that they could have been focusing on, but they weren't. They were looking at the economics. They were looking at this urban poverty that we've been talking about, and also hard to display, but they were looking at what they thought of as exploitation of labor, women's hours, child labor, working conditions, all sorts of things. They used the word exploitation, and they were very explicit that to them the perceived problem was not the existence of wealth itself, but the use of it, the distribution of it. So again, the people who behind the social gospel movement never criticized wealth creation itself. It was only the use of wealth. And what they wanted to do was to focus explicitly on these economic problems and have the church steer the policy response to the problem. They didn't think that the church was going to implement the answer. They knew that soup kitchens and other things that churches could do on their own were not the answer. But they thought, so they were looking to the state to implement the answer, but they wanted the church to play a leadership role. So, putting what they saw as Christian principles to practice through concrete policy action to be taken by the state. They understood and were explicit that this involved a tension between individualism and the needs of the polity, and they were willing to sacrifice some individualism in order to achieve these objectives. They were not secret about that. And I argue in the book that underlying this is a very strong post-millennialism. I'm not going to pause now to talk about the difference between pre- and post-millennialism, but I'm happy to come back to that if that's useful, but in effect, they saw a religious value to reforming the secular world. That's what they were doing. Now, I'm going to talk about two of the theologians involved. The earlier one, Washington Gladden, perhaps the more famous of the two. Gladden was a congregational minister. Interestingly, before he was a minister, he was a newspaper man. He was the religious editor of one of the major New York newspapers and led the crusade to get rid of Boss Tweed. It's probably not a familiar think of Boss Tweed as a corrupt urban machine politician in the most corrupt and most urban setting in the United States. And so Gladden led the campaign to get rid of Boss Tweed when he lived in New York, then moved to Columbus, Ohio, where he was the head minister at First Congregational in Columbus for the rest of his life, but he was also a very prominent figure in the Congregational Church. He was the head of the church in the Congregational Church in the United States, as in the Church of Scotland. Incidentally, the person who's the head of the church is called the moderator of the General Assembly. So Gladden was the moderator of the church's General Assembly in this period. And what was important to him was to focus not just on saving individual souls, but on restructuring the society in which these individuals lived. So this is where you start to pick up the notion of the social gospel. It was about the society, not just the individuals. And here he's explicit, talks about a twofold goal. Yes, we want to perfect man to the extent that we can, but also a perfect society. And you can read what he said. And he argues that perfection requires obedience to the second commandment. He's, of course, quoting Jesus from Matthew there, second commandment as well as the first. Some other extracts briefly from Gladden. He says you can have some aspects of some societies which are structured in the way that promote the worth of goodness in man, and others that discourage it. And he is clear which way he wants us to go. He wants to encourage the forms of social organization that move people in the right direction. He very much sees this not as just an individual choice of individuals thinking about the way American Protestant life was organized. Is not just the individual's choice of whether to answer the altar call and step up and be saved. It has to do with the influence of the society in which the individual is living. And now here I've got a few that get into the economics. He talks about inequality of conditions. Inequality of condition, incidentally, is a Tocqueville phrase. Tocqueville talked the very first sentence of Tocqueville's Democracy of America talks about the so-called equality of condition. So he's referring to that here, and the great gulf between the rich and the poor. And he, in a way that is not the same, but is congruent to what Yen He was talking about yesterday. He's talking about how this extreme inequality is bad for both sides. And this is a very old theme in America. If you go back to the very first sermon, American sermon delivered in English to Americans, and probably, I would think today, still the very best one, preached in 1630 on board the ship Arbella by John Winthrop, who was the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop goes on at some length about how inequality beyond a certain point is to be avoided because it is morally bad both for the rich and for the poor. So here we are 250 years later, and Washington Gladden is picking up on the Winthrop theme. And then he says something that I've always found positively inspiring. He says, yes, he doesn't want to claim that America in the 1880s is the first place that's had inequalities that large, but he says they have never before existed in a society founded on the doctrine that everybody is created equal. And then marvelous metaphors here, never before in which the poor had the spelling book and the newspaper and the ballot. So he's saying that if you've got literacy and democracy and a free press, then this kind of inequality is just unsustainable. Second person whom I want to focus on among the theologians, there were others, but I'm just picking two in the interest of time, is Walter Rauschenbusch, by the name, obviously, of German extraction, and not just extraction. Rauschenbusch maintained his ties to Germany throughout his lifetime. He sometimes lived here, sometimes there, was back and forth. Rauschenbusch was a Baptist minister, educated at the Baptist Foundation in Rochester, New York. And then he was most famously the minister at the second, and they called it this, the Second German Baptist Church in New York City, which was, you can still see the building on West 46th Street in New York. And then after his time as a pulpit minister, went back to become a professor at Rochester. Once again, moving in the direction that Gladden had shown him, but being more explicit now about a collective sense of sin, talking about the extremes of wealth and poverty. And then here is this nice line. He says, that is the great sin of modern humanity. What is the great sin? It's not learning to distribute the wealth justly. So to him, the great sin is not something people do at the individual level. The great sin is something about the society more broadly. And he too wants to have the church assume a leadership role. And he says the church is one of the most potent institutions and forces in Western civilization. And I don't mean to disappoint you, but what he means by church with an uppercase C is not the Catholic Church. He is referring to the collectivity of the Protestant churches in the United States. He says, in effect, he's saying the church cannot stand aside, because if the church stands aside, then that constitutes actively voting for the status quo. Says there's no such thing as thinking of the church as not being a part of the debate. The church is either on one side or the other, and it can't be apart. Talks here about the way in which, remember, this is the period of big business, huge industry developing. Think Morgan, think Rockefeller, think Carnegie, think Frick, all of these huge firms. He's talking about the religious figures have been cowed by the business world, and that the religious figures should have the strength and courage to speak up. And here he says something very interesting, and I'm going to come back to this in a minute in the context of my discussion of Rerum Novarum. He's willing to subordinate private property. He says, function of religion to teach the individual to value his soul more than his body, so forth and so on. Function of religion to teach society to value life more than property, and to value property only insofar as it forms the material basis for the higher development of life. And then he goes on, and now he's becoming very explicit. Says a private business that employs thousands of people Think back to what those steel mills looked like. Think what the McCormick factory looked like. And uses the resources of the nation, enjoys exemptions, privileges of law. He's thinking about limited liability and other features. He says, essential to the welfare of communities. That is not a private business. It's public. And he says, the sooner we abandon the fiction that it's a private business, the better off we are. So he's very explicit about not respecting the private property. Now, I want to go on and talk about the influence of this line of thinking on the development of my discipline, economics, in this particularly important period when economics was professionalizing, but in light of where we are, I wanted to say, all of this, meant to finish up, all of this took concrete form in 1908. These people formed what they then called the Federal Council of Churches, the FCC, an organization very much still with us in the United States today. The name was changed in 1950. It's now the National Council of Churches, now the NCC, and it remains, as it was in 1908, the umbrella organization for what we think of as mainline Protestant denominations. Not the evangelicals, they have their separate organization, but all of the mainliners, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and so on, they all are part of the NCC, previously the FCC. And here are just a few extracts from the very first meeting in 1908. Rich and poor, these are not classifications that show up in the doctrine of the church. And here they're explicit, they're looking to the Church of America, by which they mean themselves, not talking about the Catholic Church, which must deal with the social and industrial problems. What do they want? They want the economic practice to conform to the gospel. Talk about industrial conditions, multitudes are deprived, and so forth. And then 4 years later, in 1912, they published a tract called The Social Creed of the Churches, which was then the guiding document for mainline Protestants in this line of work for at least half a century. And all of this received its full implementation a generation later under Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Roosevelt was very much, a very interesting case, Roosevelt was very much a product of the social gospel. Before coming to Harvard as an undergraduate, Roosevelt had been educated at Groton School in Groton, Massachusetts. Groton School was founded by the Reverend Endicott Peabody, who then became, and to the end of his life, served as headmaster of Groton School. Peabody was very much a part of this social gospel movement, and as long as Peabody was alive, Roosevelt continued to be very close to his former headmaster. We have lots of correspondence between the two of them. So when you look at this enormous array of things that Roosevelt implemented, his orientation came from Peabody. Peabody was a generation younger, but Peabody's inspiration came from Gladden and Rauschenbusch and the great figures of the social gospel day. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and ask how this compares to Leo XIII's great encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. And to my view, the similarities outweigh the differences. There are differences, and I'll point to a couple. But both, I think the economic impetus is advancing industrialization. Both, there was concern for the condition of workers and apparent exploitation. One thing that's interesting in Rerum Novarum, Leo is concerned about the way in which people's work obligation are are conflicting with their religious observance. I don't know much about that, but I assume he means that some people have to work on Sundays, but he may have meant something else. Both are reacting to the widening inequality. Both are reacting to this coexistence of mass poverty with widespread industrialization, but also moral decay. Both are concerned to move the church into restore the church into a place of ethical preeminence. Of course, they mean different things by the church. There are some differences. People have commented over the decades on the organicist concept of society that's present in Leo's document. I don't think that's there in the Social Gospel. And in the Rerum Novarum, there's also a rejection of the idea of labor services as a factor of production that should be traded on the market, and that's not present in the Social Gospel. Here are a few little extracts from Rerum Novarum. Talks about the poverty of the masses, talks about the inequality, small number of very rich men laying on the laboring poor a yoke, talks about the greed of unchecked competition. I'm not sure the Social Gospel people were interested in usury, but of course Leo was. And then the rich have to refrain from cutting down workmen's earnings. And then here's where you start to see the rejection of the idea of labor as traded on the market. Leo talks about a dictate of natural justice that's more imperious and ancient, he says, than just any bargain between man and man. What he's referring to in the bargain between man and man, that Smith repeatedly uses the word bargain when he talks about wage setting in The Wealth of Nations. Wage is a bargain between the laborer and the employer. And Leo talks about how the condition of the working classes is the pressing question of the hour. But also, and this is why I emphasized Walter Rauschenbusch's views on private property, here's from Leo to an American. This is quite interesting. The first and most fundamental principle, and an American reading this would expect any of a variety of things to follow, but not what actually follows, is the inviolability of private property. So absolutely have to respect private property. And he keeps coming back to it. Some paragraphs later talks about the duty of safeguarding private property. He's set to protect lawful owners from spoliation. Later he talks about just assuming as a principle that private property must be held, he says, sacred, very interesting word, and inviolable. The standard view is that this is a reaction, this is still a reaction of the ultramontane church to the trauma of the French Revolution. I am not a scholar of the church in this period, but so it's not up to me to say, but that's the usual interpretation. And again, contrast that with the statement by Rauschenbusch that he just thinks once you get beyond a certain size, a private corporation isn't private anymore. It's a public enterprise. Now, I want to talk about what the effect of the social gospel was on economic thinking, because my whole enterprise in this work is to look at the way in which religious thinking influences economic thinking, and I think the social gospel, which Jörg asked me to address, is a perfect example of this. To repeat, this is a very crucial period for economics, especially in America. This is the period in which each of these social sciences, but economics in particular, is professionalizing. Go back 20 years earlier, there were no such thing as economics departments in American universities. By 1890, There were at least a dozen of them, and there's no surprise that if you look at that list of a dozen, and you look at what are the top 10 economics departments in the world today, well, same, the overlap is close to 100%. Journals, the oldest one is my department's, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, started in the 1880s in the Harvard Economics Department. The Journal of Political Economy started a year later at the University of Chicago, still the leading journals in the field. Creation of the American Economic Association I've mentioned, but it was also intellectually a key period for economics. This was the time of the marginalist revolution, and it's a recognition of a kind of intellectual maturity of an advancing discipline, and this means that there is a different kind of scope for the external influence on the development of a discipline than was true at its infant stage under Smith and Hume. Here's a useful statement by Thomas Kuhn. This is the Kuhn of scientific revolutions, whatever it's called. Kuhn points out that early in the development of a new field, think of the time of Smith and Hume, all sorts of very fundamental influences are brought to bear on fundamental concepts, and as the discipline matures, its fundamental concepts become insulated from the outside, and where then is the outside influence to be found? It's at the level of application and methodology, and that's exactly what we see in looking at the development of economics during this period following the social gospel. So I want to look at two of the great figures of my country's economics from this period. John Bates, the economists will recognize them, John Bates Clark and Richard T. Ely, one a theorist primarily, that's Clark, one a methodologist, that's Ely, applied economist. And unlike Smith and Hume, here these people really were religiously motivated. These people were. Clark, Clark was a Congregationalist. When he was an undergraduate at Amherst, thought that he was going to go to the Yale Divinity School and study for the congregational ministry. His professor at Amherst persuaded him to come to Germany, where he studied, among other things, at Heidelberg under Knies. And Ely started off life, he was born into a Presbyterian family, but he found the determinism of Orthodox Calvinism to be intellectually unhospitable to him. He tried for a while to be a Universalist and eventually became an Episcopalian, very much not a predestinarian. And Ely, too, was educated here in Germany, importantly at Heidelberg. And in both men, you see the influence of Knies and the so-called German historical school very much at work. So what were they doing? Here are a few extracts from the theorist, John Bates Clark. And he's talking about a broader view of humans. He doesn't want the society to be given over to what he calls an ignoble scramble for profit. A nice phrase, but again, from the not from a theologian now, not from a pulpit preacher. This is from the foremost American economic theorist of the day. Talks again, he's echoing Gladden here, talks about how the society as a whole transforms individual nature and how the simple organism, he means individual humans, are made higher and better by becoming part of the secondary organism, by which he means the society as a whole. He too believes that the church remains a primary influence. Again, this is not a theologian speaking. This is an economist who wants the church to play a role. talking about the distribution of the results of industry, and he phrases it in an interesting way. He says a better distribution might atone for some diminution in the amount produced. Well, stating it in more modern language and getting rid of the religious notion of atonement, what he's saying is that there is a trade-off between the distribution and the total amount of production, and he wants to be at some interior solution on that trade-off. He doesn't want to go directly want to go to the edge where all of the emphasis is on the total amount. And so you can just see this translating into policy presumptions, and so you might say somebody on the right today argues, well, you know, if we raise taxes in order to fund such and such a program, that will dull incentives and will produce less. And Clark would have nodded his head and said, yes, well, this is what it's all about. More explicit, the ultimate end of political economy is not just quantitative increase in wealth, and he has a very sharp denunciation of what he calls extreme laissez-faire policy. Come now to Ely. Ely had a very interesting view. In some respects, I regard Ely as the more interesting of the two economists, but that may just be because I'm an applied economist, not a theorist. Talks about, here he's echoing again Gladden and Rauschenbusch. Incidentally, Ely and Gladden were very close personally. Ely was the principal founder of the American Economic Association, and when Ely convened the committee meeting, a small group of people, to draft the charter for the American Economic Association, he included Gladden. Gladden was, of course, not an economist, but Gladden was present and part of the drafting committee. So talks about that we've solved by that time the problem of production, and what remains is the problem of distribution, and talks about needing to subserve the end and purpose of human existence for all members of society. And he says you just can't claim that we're there. And what's the problem? It's a waste of humans. Humans are wasted if they are not allowed to achieve their full potential. Like Clark, he's very explicit that he doesn't care about maximizing production. He says, well, let's suppose it's true that keeping wages low gets us the maximum production. Is that just not the point? He's interested in these other issues, child labor, female labor, excess hours, all this together. And again, this is the leading economist of the day. Here is the part in which Ely pioneered what is the principal tool, the principal method of modern empirical economics. Let me just pick an example. Suppose we want to know what determines I'll just pick one. Saving rates. Why do people save what they do? Well, a natural thing that we would do now is we would compare saving rates in America and saving rates in Germany and saving rates in China and saving rates in Britain, and we would notice that all of the saving rates are different, and we would say, okay, what are the differences in institutions or other arrangements in America and Germany and China and Britain that account for these differences in the observed saving rates, and from that we can infer something about what determines saving. Well, of course, we talk about this today and everybody says, yes, of course, that's how it's done. This was a creation of Ely. Ely is where that line of thought comes from. And he says self-interest is not a constant force. What's behind self-interest is laws and institutions on which these motives act. And what you can see right there is the influence of his teacher, Karl Knies, at Heidelberg. This is where the German the German historical school enters modern Western economics right there. And this is also, he phrases in an interesting way, this is the period in which the availability of data starts to become great available. And he says, once data start to become available and people were observing and measuring these regularities in the data, there was a sense of fatalism. And people says, well, you know, behavior patterns are predetermined and inevitable because we can measure them. But then, he says, further inquiry revealed differences between different lands. This is where the institutional approach comes in. And he's getting this in part from his friend Gladden. Gladden talks about there are certain forms of organization which promote worth and so forth. And so in addition to the influence of, in effect, Ely is combining what he got from his teacher Knies and what he got from his friend Gladden, one, I guess you'd call Knies an economist or a historian, and Gladden a theologian. Now, what parts of this have survived? I want to conclude. Well, the marginalist revolution certainly has. That's the core of our modern analytical apparatus. Interest in the institutions, absolutely that is there. We talk about the institutions, and that's clearly a legacy of what these people picked up in their graduate study in Germany. Exploitation of the systematic statistical data. If you go back to read Smith or Malthus, for example, Malthus was 1798 was the first edition. It is astonishing to the modern eye how anecdotal the view of empirical observation was in those days. You know, economists are fond of making fun of political scientists for confusing anecdotes with data. But if we read Malthus and Smith, we realize we have to have a little more humility in that, because that's absolutely what they did, not under Ely. This was the period in which systematic data came in to repeat this use of comparing one country to another, or within the US, one state to another, one time period for another. All of these things that we take for granted today. In my department this year, there will probably be 75 to 100 senior year undergraduates, our top-end students who are writing their senior honors theses in economics. A good prediction is that 3/4 of them will do exactly that. That is what we have people do today. Again, that's the German historical school coming into economic research. And following Gladden and Rauschenbusch, now economics has become not just a descriptive effort, but an ameliorative effort. It's aimed at making the world different. If you pick up any economic journal today, look at anything in the American Economic Review, the QJE, the JPE, any of these all-purpose economic journals, it's almost universal to start off with an introductory section to your article that ties your work to some policy issue. It's almost inevitable to end with some statement of policy conclusions. Where did that come from? This is the period when it came in. Again, I argue that it's a result of postmillennialism, resistance to deterministic thinking. Economists don't like models in which initial conditions are determinative of outcomes. We avoid those. That's where this comes in. Here's a nice statement by Ely. So let me conclude. I believe that economics was, of course, yes, a product of the Enlightenment, and it still is. But I think that does not in any way mean that the product of economics is not a product of religious thinking. It very much is. And I think the role of religious thinking continues to be at work in economics. It's all about human choices and their possibilities. Look at the textbook for any introductory economics course. What do? We start off with the choices made by individuals, choices made by firms. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still the absolute heart of our analytical apparatus. And I think if you scratch any economist, you will get the more expansive and optimistic view of the human enterprise that was there. And to advert now to Clark and especially Ely, I think policy-oriented economics, in the form that Ely gave us, is still an ameliorative effort, and it's still guided by these important features. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.